Joining us now, former vice presidential candidate, 2016, ran with Hillary Clinton, man that needs, of course, no introduction across Virginia or across the country. The junior U.S. Senator from Virginia, Democrat, Senator Tim Kaine. Senator, great to have you with us again, sir.
No, good to be with you.
Let's go. We've got a number of things to talk about. I want to focus on your legislation about unemployment, spouse unemployment for the military.
You bet.
Let's start, though, if I may, with what appears to be a budget compromise in Congress today to avert a shutdown. Do you think this is moving in the right direction or not?
In many ways, John, it is. Yeah, I'm very happy about it. One of the things that's most important is not just averting a shutdown. Congress has been doing, as you know, these continuing resolutions where we just punt and we don't really do budgets. We will just say, well, we'll just keep doing what we were doing yesterday for the next month and see if we can figure it out. And these kind of short-term CRs really harm the ability to plan. Our military especially gets hit by them. And Secretary Mattis has been saying, return to forward-looking budgeting that's based on priorities rather than these CRs. So the deal that we've struck is actually going to be a forward-looking budget for the remainder of this fiscal year through September 30, but next fiscal year as well. So it will really give the military and others predictability. And, if we can provide nothing else, let's at least provide some predictability around budgets. And then in terms of funding, military, infrastructure, opioid treatment, VA services, we fought for a lot of priorities that were good for Virginia and good for the country that are in the bill. So I was very happy that the deal was announced.
So basically what you're looking at is $83 billion increased spending for the military, thereabouts, right?
Yes.
Average over a two-year period. And somewhere in the area of $62, $63 billion increase in domestic spending to address some of the things that you talked about.
Right.
Now, it's going to the House today, and already we've had a number of Freedom Caucus Republicans and other conservatives saying, look, this is just increasing the debt. Spending is out of control. Debt continues to go up. Nobody's addressing it. You and I have had this conversation many times. Right now, it looks like the debt's going to approach what, Senator, 21 trillion. I mean, is there a number that everybody has to really focus on, that if it gets up to that, everybody starts saying, look, we just have to stop?
John, we do need to have the discussion. I mean, the sad reality of it is many of the House members who are complaining about the debt and the deficit just voted for a tax bill that all the estimates said it would increase the debt and deficit by $1 trillion to $1.5 trillion, and they voted for that, and that was fine. I had some concerns about it. I put an amendment on the floor that would have done a lot of good tax reform, including reducing the corporate tax rate, but not busted the deficit, but they wouldn't go for it. So they voted for this deficit-busting tax bill, and now they don't like spending because it'll increase the deficit by a much lower number. So, we do have to grapple with it. Your question about is there a number, actually there's not just a number. The right way to manage debt is the way states and cities manage debt. We never have a raw number. What you do is you set two guidelines, the total debt as a percentage of your domestic product and the debt service payment as a percentage of your annual budgetary outlays. And at the local and state level, that's how we manage debt. And we ought to do the same thing at the federal level. We don't have a federal debt policy of that kind. And I'm working with colleagues on the Budget Committee where I serve to see if we could articulate a debt management policy and then manage to it. And, there's plenty of room for partisan argument about how to manage to a target. Do you increase taxes? Do you reduce expenses? And do you do a little bit of both? So you give yourself all kinds of room to argue about how to do it, but the problem is we don't have a debt management policy as a nation. We need to do it like states and cities do.
Well, look, I think you're right. And if we had that, then we could have the debate about what the parameters should be or what the touch points should be. But right now, all we have is a process of increasing the debt limit. Look, you're right, both sides of the aisle. I don't like the debt going up, and we've had this discussion many times, but I was one of the biggest media cheerleaders for the Trump tax cut out there.
Yep.
So what tends to happen is if we like the policy, the debt's okay. If we don't like the policy, it's bad debt. And that's happening on both sides of the aisle.
Yeah, I think that's fair. That is a fair critique of the way it's operating. And but you could get to a debt management policy. For example, we often talk about if total debt as a percentage is higher than 70% of GDP, 70 or 80%, and that's publicly held debt, you start to run into challenges. By that measure, we're okay now, but if you look down the road and you just project for debt to grow as people age, et cetera, we'll be in trouble in a few years. Well, if we set a policy, we can manage to the policy, and I hope that we might, on the Budget Committee in both houses, move to that way. One of the things in the budget deal yesterday was the appointment of a select committee, a bicameral committee, to look at budget reform issues. How can we get out of these short-term CRs? But something like a debt management policy might be part of what a reform that this committee would look at over the next year.
We're chatting with former candidate for vice president and Democratic senator from Virginia, Tim Kaine, who is also the co-chair of the Senate Military Family Caucus. And you're moving legislation now focusing on the impact of spousal unemployment in the military because of the moves. Can you explain that to us and how your legislation would work?
Yeah, John, absolutely. So, as you know, because we've talked about this, when I came into the Senate, I was focused on this issue of why is the veterans' unemployment rate higher than the national average, which for Iraq and Afghan veterans, it was, as recently as 2013, significantly higher. Good news, we passed legislation. A whole lot of folks in society are working to fight this problem. The unemployment rate for vets is now lower than the national average. That's a good thing. But while that's been going the right way, military spouse unemployment continues to be a little bit harder to measure, but it's anywhere from 3 to 5 times higher than the national average. And as you point out, it's often because of moves. A spouse will have a job, will move to a new location after getting settled in, hard to find a job. Sometimes the spouse has a job with a credential like a teacher or a barber or a lawyer or a real estate agent. You got to get newly credentialed in a new state. That costs money and it takes time. So we find the military spouse unemployment rate being quite a bit higher than the national average. I hear these stories all the time around Virginia. So I put in a bill, Military Spouse Employment Act of 2018, 2 days ago, and basically it does 4 things. It first would help spouses with direct hiring by giving federal agencies the ability to use expedited hiring procedures to hire military spouses. We do some of those things with veterans now, and some of the best jobs around military bases are often federal civilian jobs, DOD, Department of Energy, other agencies, and so give them a more expedited way to hire spouses. Second, training. There's an account that military spouses use called the Career Advancement Account that you can use to take courses and things like that. Most spouses really aren't aware of this benefit. There needs to be much more work to do to put the word out there. But let's allow the monies not just to be used to take a class, but again, somebody ran into me and said, hey, look, I'm a lawyer in this state, military spouse. If I move to another state, I can become a member of the bar, but to transfer my credential from one state to the next costs $1,800. Wow. And that's tough on the military salary. Let's use the training resources to allow recredentialing. Third is counseling. There's a lot of counseling that military members get as they transition to civilian life, transition assistance program on base, something called Military One Source that helps with counseling after a transition, but many of those resources are not available to spouses. They're just available to the active duty member, and transition is a family thing, not just for the active duty. So let's let spouses use some of those resources too. And finally, child care. The cost of child care is a big, big barrier to many military spouses, and so we've got some strategies to increase the number of qualified child care folks who can work on bases or around bases, which should bring prices down, and that would help.
So your legislation, Senator Kaine, as I understand it, is endorsed by Blue Star Families, the Military Officers Association of America, National Military Families Association, to name a few, the American Legion. So who would not be in favor of this?
John, I'll tell you if I find out, but so far I've had no pushback on it. Now, we worked in advance with both the Republican and Democratic staffs of the Armed Services Committee, so we've drafted it with their help, and they are on board. We've drafted it with the help of the Pentagon, and the Pentagon is on board. So my idea is I introduced the bill Tuesday. As you know, in the spring every year on armed services, we write the defense authorizing bill. Right. And my goal would be, as we're writing the bill, to just fold this proposal right into it. We do a lot of provisions in the authorizing bill dealing with military families. And so my goal is to get it attached to the authorizing bill, which we would hopefully vote out of the committee in May, vote off the floor before the 4th of July. And I expect this to get wide support on both sides of the aisle based on the support we've already been able to receive.
Look, I think you're in good shape with this, and I appreciate the effort on it. And those of us that have friends and family in the military, this is a real issue because of the moves and so many spouses. As you say, you just look at the numbers, between 12 and 25% spousal military unemployment, which is either 5 or 10 times higher than in the national average. So
I heard the heartbreaking story, John, about a military spouse who moved to Guam. This was an event I did in Suffolk last week. And she said she moved there. She was applying for jobs that she was qualified for and not getting interviews, kind of, okay, next level down, next level down, next level down. And she finally, gets an interview for a job she thinks she's really going to like. And then they ask her, the civilian employer asks her, what brings you to Guam? Well, I'm here with my husband who's an aviator. Oh, okay, well, we'll give you a call back. And then she never heard back. And it's just that if an employer is faced with a couple of applicants and he knows one might have to move because they're sacrificing for their country, but they might have to move, they're likely to hire the person who doesn't have to move. And that's just a sad reality of the sacrifice military spouses make. We won't be able to come up with a silver bullet that will solve it all, but I think these are 4 practical ways that are based on, the stories that we've been told by military spouses, and they should help.
All right, makes a lot of sense. Senator Tim Kaine, we only have a couple minutes, and we got to take off. But let me ask you this about the DACA situation. Your leader, Minority Leader Chuck Schumer, took DACA now out of the budgetary discussion, so that's out. We're just going to have a clean budget. But you've got a deadline coming up at the end of, a couple weeks in March?
Yeah, March 5. And
the president has laid out, you have to admit, Senator, the President Trump has laid out a pretty compelling compromise here. He's taken the 700,000 DACA applicants, even though we campaigned for no amnesty for them. He said, look, I'm going to give them amnesty. But he said there's another million that never bothered to apply for whatever reason. They were afraid, they didn't want to be on a register, or they didn't know about it. But we got about 2 million children here that came under no decision of their own. I'm going to give them amnesty. I'm going to give them a pathway to be a U.S. citizen over a 10 to 12-year period. I'm going to make this right. And in return for that, I'm looking for long-term immigration legislative reform that has eluded 9 presidents dating back to LBJ. That includes border security, getting rid of chain migration, not having an open border situation, and revamping the visa lottery system. Isn't that a reasonable compromise, Senator?
John, all of the issues are issues that should be on the table as part of a comprehensive discussion. Here's a challenge we have. We have a March 5th deadline for these dreamers. The discussion was very heavily focused on a trade. Can we find a path to protect the dreamers in exchange for ample border security? That was the negotiation. Can we find that? Look, these issues are well understood by the public. They understand the dreamer issue, and they understand border security because President Trump campaigned on that. Here is the challenge. When the president added the diversity visa program and the family unification issues to it right before the deadline, these are very complicated issues, especially the family unification one. They're very, very complex. And a whole group of people who weren't that focused on the dreamer issue, they might support dreamers, but for many immigrant populations, that wasn't their issue, but they're deeply affected by family migration. We've never had hearings about the family unification issue. There haven't been proposals put forth on the table. So what I'm doing is I'm in a group of bipartisan senators, and we are trying to find a deal that is at the core a trade for permanent protection for dreamers and ample border security, but that would touch on the other 2 pillars in some way to show that, hey, look, this doesn't have to be the end of the immigration discussion. We can maybe do some things right now, but there are other issues as well. The status of the TPS recipients who are in the country, E-Verify for employers, visa reforms. There are other issues, and maybe if we do the core deal, but we touch on the other 2 pillars as a showing, yeah, we're willing to have this discussion, then we can have a down the road phase too. But we do have this March 5th deadline staring us in the face, and we need to solve that one, and then maybe start into, in a good faith way, the discussion on the other matters.
I don't think the president, from talking to him, is going to go for what you just said. I think he's determined that he's got one shot here to get this done and to go forward on some of the campaign promises that he made. And the only thing I want to say on chain migration, I know you call it family unification, is even with the Dreamers and with all immigrants here, the president said that you can bring your spouse and you can bring your dependent children. It's just that you can't bring grandma, your third cousin from a second marriage, which is what chain migration has turned into. And the president wants to go to a merit-based system where people that have a skill level or an education that fits an economic need the United States have, they get pushed to the front of the line, just like Australia, just like Canada. This isn't new.
And John, again, I'll say I don't mind having that discussion. You know, let's have a hearing about it in the Judiciary Committee and do it. But here, just to give you an example, the day after the President's State of the Union, just coincidentally, I was in Northern Virginia, and I had back-to-back meetings with leadership in the Vietnamese American community up here and then the Korean American community. Bipartisan groups were sitting around the table. They have been supportive of Dreamers, sort of out of solidarity. We need to find something with Dreamers, but that was not their big issue. But then they hear the president the night before saying, you know, we need to end chain migration. Any family member can bring all kinds of people here. Some of these folks have had family members on waiting lists for 10 or 15 years. So the president made it sound like it's just this big open door, which it's not. Not at all. The waiting lists are incredibly long. But all of a sudden they're like, wow, we didn't know the family unification issue was on the table, and they're very worried about it. It is an issue that would bear discussion, but it bears discussion with some deliberation so that we can make sure we get it right. You know, the president created the March 5th deadline, and we got to act by the March 5th deadline. So, you know, you're right. We could do something that he wouldn't support, but we're the Article I branch. I mean, we don't need to play Mother May I with the president. We act, then he acts, and then if he takes an action, we may have another action we can take. But I think we can. The good news is I'm part of a large bipartisan group that Senator Susan Collins kind of is the host for in her office. But we've got equal number of Dems and Republicans. We've had nearly 30 folks involved in these discussions, and we're getting close to something. We'll be on the floor with it next week. We're getting close to something that I think can get well north of 60 votes and pass in the Senate. And then we'll see where it goes from there.
Well, look, you're having the conversation. That's the main thing. And plus, when you're working with Susan Collins, she's very tough not to like. I can tell you that. I've met her many times, and she is a very nice woman and works hard. So everything starts with the conversation we're having now. Senator, your staff is saying you have to go. Thank you for your time.
Hey, John, great to be with you. Look forward to talking soon.